Dad always tested me and brother with impossible tasks. Prove your worth. When I failed his final test, he cut me off completely. 15 years later, when he was dying, what I showed him made him cry for the first time in his life. I still remember the first time I realized my dad wasn't like other dads. I was 7, struggling to reach the top shelf in our garage to grab some tools he needed. Instead of helping me, he just stood there, arms crossed, watching me wobble on that rickety step stool. When I fell, skinning my knee raw on the concrete, he didn't rush over, didn't check if I was okay, just shook his head and told me I needed to figure out a better strategy, that life doesn't reward weakness. That was my dad, Theodore. Old-school military guy who never really left the service mentally, even after 20 years out. After Mom died, cancer, I was 4, Xavier was 6, Dad basically turned our childhood into some twisted boot camp. Everything, and I mean everything, was a test. Homework? Not enough to get A's, had to be perfect scores or it wasn't worth shit. Sports? Second place was first loser. Chores? Had to be done exactly his way or do it all over again. And always, always with the same damn line. Prove your worth, boy. My brother Xavier figured the system out way faster than me. He'd smile and nod and say, "Yes, sir," while secretly cutting corners wherever possible. He learned to tell Dad exactly what he wanted to hear. Me? I was the dumbass who thought honesty and actual effort would matter more than results. Growing up in our faded blue-collar neighborhood, most kids worried about normal stuff. Video games, crushes, homework. Meanwhile, I was trying to fix our leaking roof at 12 because Dad decided that was that day's test. Xavier held the ladder and whispered for me to just put some duct tape up there and call it fixed. Dad wouldn't check. He was right. Dad never checked the actual work, just whether you claimed victory. I refused to half-ass it. Spent 6 hours in the summer heat patching that roof properly. When I came down, sunburned and exhausted, Dad just nodded and handed me a list of yard work that needed doing before sundown. No praise, no thanks, definitely no payment. That was our normal. Every accomplishment immediately minimized. Every new challenge presented like it was the real measure of our worth. By high school, the tests got more intense. When I was 16, Dad woke me at 4 a.m. on a school day and told me the car needed a new alternator and I wasn't going to school until it was fixed. No instructions, no help, just the manual and a basic toolkit. I missed 2 days of classes, watched about 20 YouTube tutorials on my ancient phone with cracked screen, budgeting to buy it myself after mowing lawns all summer, and finally figured it out. Xavier would have found someone else to do it or claimed it couldn't be done. I actually did the work, but guess who Dad respected more? The bullshitter who knew how to play the game. My breaking point almost came senior year. Dad decided my full-ride academic scholarship to state wasn't good enough because it wasn't an Ivy League school, called it settling for mediocrity while we ate generic cereal at our scratched kitchen table, told me Xavier was going places because he was strategic. Yeah, strategic =, lying about community service hours and cheating on his SATs. But he got into a fancy private school that he later flunked out of, but that's part 2 shit LOL. College was my escape. Finally got some distance, made actual friends who didn't make everything a competition, had a shitty apartment with 3 other guys, worked part-time at the campus store, and for the first time felt like I could breathe without someone measuring my oxygen efficiency. Then came the final test, junior year, spring break. I'm 21, finally feeling like I'm building something for myself. Good grades, decent social life, talking to this girl Lauren from my econ class, things looking up. I get a call from Dad. He never calls. Red flag number 1. His exact words still ring in my ears. The family business needs new blood. Time to step up. Need to know if you're man enough for real responsibility. Time to prove your worth. Translation: drop out now and come run the struggling hardware store he'd bought after retirement. The same store he'd been complaining about for 3 years straight. The same store he'd refused to modernize or update despite my suggestions about online inventory and digital marketing. I told him I had 1 year left, asked if it could wait until after graduation. His response? Real men don't make excuses. Xavier had already agreed to help part-time. BS. Xavier was working some pyramid scheme at the time and living in Dad's basement. That night, I made the hardest call of my life. I told him no, told him I was finishing my degree, told him I'd help after graduation, but not on his timeline. The silence on the phone lasted so long I thought he'd hung up. Then came the coldest voice I'd ever heard from him, and that's saying something. He told me I'd failed the final test, that I'd chosen the easy path, just like he always suspected I would, that I'd proven I didn't have what it takes. I remember getting angry, really angry. For the first time ever, I fired back, told him that his tests were bullshit, that moving goalposts wasn't parenting, it was emotional manipulation, that I was done trying to earn his approval when the game was rigged from the start. He hung up. I thought he needed time to cool off. I was wrong. 2 days later, my rent check bounced. Turned out Dad had been my co-signer on the apartment and called the landlord to remove himself. My phone got shut off next. Still on the family plan I'd been paying my share of since high school. Then my tuition payment for the upcoming quarter failed to process. He'd closed the joint account where I'd been saving my contribution. I got an email from him. 2 sentences. You're on your own now. Don't come home. Finding out the rest happened in pieces. My aunt called me from her secret prepaid phone. Dad had forbidden family from contacting me. She told me Dad had legally removed me from his will, that he'd given Xavier power of attorney and partial ownership of both the store and house, that he'd told everyone I'd stolen money from him, complete BS, as justification. I was completely cut off. No family, no safety net, no home to return to. All my worldly possessions fit in 2 duffel bags in my friend's living room where I was crashing. The final blow came when I saw Xavier's post on social media, a picture of him and Dad in front of the store, Xavier holding a set of keys with the caption, "Proud to be taking over the family legacy. Some people just don't have what it takes." #blessed. I stared at that post for an hour straight, my hands shaking, something breaking and reforming inside me. That night, I promised myself 2 things. 1. I would never beg for Theodore's approval again. 2. Someday, he would regret throwing me away. The next morning, I started planning, not just how to survive, but how to make Theodore and Xavier pay. This wasn't about proving my worth anymore. This was about justice. And revenge served ice fucking cold. People always say success is the best revenge. They're wrong. Success is just the foundation. The real revenge comes when you use that success to systematically dismantle everything your enemy holds dear. It took 15 years. But what happened when I finally confronted my dying father with the results of his final test? That's a story worth telling. Update. After getting kicked out with literally nothing but my old Toyota and whatever I could fit in it, I spent the first 3 nights sleeping in my car in a Walmart parking lot. The October nights were getting cold AF, and I'd wake up with the windows completely fogged, shivering despite wearing 3 layers. My bank account had exactly $547.83 in it. That was it. My father had always controlled our finances. Teaching responsibility, he called it, which meant keeping us dependent while calling it a lesson. The family cell phone plan cut off within 48 hours. The small account he'd set up for emergencies emptied. My meal card for university canceled. I checked into the cheapest motel I could find and applied to every single entry-level job within walking distance. Got hired at a sandwich shop making minimum wage. The manager took one look at me and knew I was desperate. Gave me as many hours as legally possible. Would work opening to closing, then go back to my motel room that smelled like cigarettes and mildew, eat ramen, and pass out. The first month was pure survival mode. No time to even process what happened with my dad or think about Xavier taking over everything I was supposed to help build. Just work, sleep, eat the cheapest food possible, repeat. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. You either stay there or you start climbing. And I was not going to stay there. My old roommate from school, Marco, let me crash on his couch after the motel money ran out. Bro literally saved my life. He even loaned me his old laptop so I could keep up with my classes online. Had to drop from full-time to part-time student, but I refused to quit completely. That would mean Theodore won. 6 months in, and things started to stabilize a bit. Had a slightly better job at a warehouse, found a room to rent with 3 other guys in a crappy apartment. Still ate mostly ramen and peanut butter sandwiches, but at least I wasn't hungry all the time. That's when Xavier texted me. First contact from anyone in my family since the day. Just seeing his name pop up on my screen made my hands shake. Asterisk, we need to talk about Dad and the business. Things aren't great. I didn't respond. Left him on red for 3 weeks. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown. Neutral territory. When I saw him, I barely recognized my own brother. Dark circles under his eyes, hair thinning already at 28, dressed in what used to be an expensive shirt, but now looked rumpled and stained. Xavier had aged 10 years in 6 months. He didn't come to apologize. He came to complain. Dad was impossible to work with. The business was struggling. Suppliers were backing out. He was working 16-hour days, and nothing was ever good enough for Theodore. Like, seriously? Did he expect sympathy from me? The brother who got completely cut off, while he got everything handed to him? I just sat there, letting him talk himself out. And that's when I realized something. Xavier wasn't the golden child. He was just another puppet Dad was using. But unlike me, Xavier never had the courage to cut the strings. When he asked if I'd consider coming back to help out, I laughed in his face and walked out. That night, I couldn't sleep, not from sadness or regret, but because something was taking shape in my mind. A plan. A year later, I met Lauren at a friend's game night. She was smart, funny, called out my BS immediately, and somehow still wanted to hang out with me. On our 3rd date, I told her everything about my family. Expected her to run for the hills, TBH. Instead, she got angry for me. Not the fake sympathy people usually give, but genuine outrage. When she asked what I planned to do about it, I realized I'd been so focused on surviving that I hadn't thought beyond that. That night changed everything. Having someone believe in me, someone who saw my worth without me having to prove anything. It was like oxygen to a drowning man. With Lauren's support, I finished my degree. Took me 2 extra years of night classes while working full-time, but I did it. No help from Daddy Dearest. Every time I wanted to quit, I'd picture Theodore's face when he told me I was worthless without him. Use that anger as fuel. Meanwhile, I kept tabs on the family business through old contacts and public records. Thank God for online databases. Things were going downhill fast. Xavier wasn't cut out for running things. He'd always just been good at telling Dad what he wanted to hear. I started saving every single penny. Lived like a broke college student even after getting better paying work. Lauren thought I was crazy but supported me anyway. We moved in together to save on rent, drove used cars, never ate out, no vacation. By year 3, I had enough saved to start making moves. Small ones at first. Invested in some stocks, learned everything I could about the industry my father's business was in, networked with his competitors. Then came the first big break. Found out through a mutual connection that one of Dad's major suppliers was looking to sell their distribution rights. The same supplier who'd been with Dad for 20 years. The one he'd always bragged could never be replaced. Called in every favor, maxed out my credit cards, borrowed from Lauren's parents, who, unlike mine, were actually decent human beings, and somehow scraped together enough for a down payment. Bought those distribution rights through a shell entity, so Theodore would never know it was me. Then raised their prices on him by 15%. Petty? Absolutely. Effective? You better believe it. That was just the beginning. Over the next 5 years, I systematically positioned myself to acquire or influence every single business connection my father relied on, never using my real name, always through intermediaries or shell companies. Lauren thought I was obsessed, and maybe I was, But this wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. Found out through family gossip that Theodore was telling everyone I'd become a drug addict, and that's why he'd cut me off. The audacity of this man. Even my few remaining relatives stopped contacting me because they believed his lies. Meanwhile, Xavier was drowning. The business was down to half its former size. He'd call me every few months, always with the same desperate tone. I'd listen, offer vague sympathy, then use whatever information he gave me to tighten the screws a little more. Is that manipulative? Maybe, but after everything Theodore put me through, I couldn't find it in me to care. Year 7, Lauren and I got married. Small ceremony, just close friends. No family on my side. By then we'd moved into a modest house in a decent neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but ours. Every morning I'd wake up and think about how Theodore said I'd never amount to anything without him. Each milestone was another middle finger to his memory. Got a promotion? Fuck you, Dad. Lauren pregnant with our first kid? Fuck you again, Dad. The real turning point came in year 10. Xavier called me drunk at 2 a.m., sobbing about how Theodore had finally pushed him out too. Apparently, the business had tanked so badly that Dad had sold majority control to outside investors, blaming Xavier for the failure. I felt nothing. No satisfaction. No pity for Xavier. Just emptiness. That should have been my warning sign to let it go. Normal people would move on. But I wasn't normal anymore. Theodore had made sure of that with his tests and his constant demands to prove your worth. So instead, I made my boldest move yet. Contacted those same investors, revealing my connection to the business and my intimate knowledge of its operations. Offered to help them turn things around for a price. They were desperate enough to agree. Within 6 months, I was effectively controlling my father's legacy from the shadows. He still owned 30%, but had zero decision-making power. The investors trusted me because I was delivering results. What Theodore didn't know was that I was strategically rebuilding value only to set up the final takedown. I hired investigators to dig through decades of business records, found sketchy transactions, tax gray areas, old debts that had been hidden. Every skeleton in Theodore's business closet was documented and organized. Xavier reached out again, this time with news that hit me harder than expected. Theodore was sick, cancer, terminal, maybe 6 months left. For the first time in 15 years, I felt something crack in my resolve. Not forgiveness, never that, but a sense of urgency. If I was going to complete my plan, it had to be now. I spent the next 3 months finalizing everything, liquidated investments, took out loans, called in every favor I'd built up over a decade. By the time I was done, I personally controlled enough voting shares and debt obligations to completely take over what remained of Theodore's business empire. All the paperwork was signed, all the T's crossed, and I's dotted. I now owned the thing he deemed me unworthy to even participate in. The day I got confirmation that everything was official, I sat alone in my home office, staring at the documents spread across my desk. 15 years of planning, 15 years of sacrifice, 15 years of nursing a rage so deep it had become part of my identity. I picked up my phone and texted Xavier a simple message. I'm coming to see Dad. Don't tell him it's me. Time to finish this. Update 2. The hospital parking lot was almost empty when I pulled in. 3:17 a.m. Visitors weren't allowed that late, but Xavier had arranged everything with the night staff. Told them I was flying in from out of town. Not completely a lie. I had deliberately taken a flight to a neighboring city and driven 2 hours just to keep my movements hidden. The hallways had that weird hospital smell, disinfectant trying and failing to cover up the scent of sickness. My footsteps echoed against the linoleum floors as I followed the room number 412, 414, 416. There it was, 418. I paused outside the door, my portfolio tucked under my arm. 15 years of planning for this moment, and suddenly I felt a flicker of doubt, not about what I was doing, fuck no, but about whether I'd feel anything at all when I saw him. Xavier was slumped in a chair next to the bed, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I entered, eyes widening slightly. Hadn't seen me in person for almost 5 years. I'd put on some weight, grown a beard, looked more like our mom now than the skinny kid who'd been thrown out. And then I saw Theodore, the man who had dominated my childhood with his booming voice and impossible standards, was now a withered husk in a hospital bed. Oxygen tubes in his nose, skin yellow-gray, arms like twigs on top of the blanket. The cancer had eaten away at him, leaving behind this hollow shell. For a split second I felt nothing. Then a wave of anger so intense, my vision actually blurred around the edges. This was the man who had controlled my life with fear? This weak, pathetic figure? Xavier mumbled something about Theodore being asleep most of the time now, pain meds keeping him under. That was fine. I could wait. Told Xavier to go get some coffee, that I wanted to sit with Dad alone for a bit. After he left, I set up my laptop on the small hospital table and arranged my documents. Then I sat in the chair and just watched Theodore breathe. Each shallow rise and fall of his chest felt like another tick of a clock counting down to something inevitable. His eyes fluttered open around 4 a.m., confused at first, then focusing on my face. I saw the exact moment recognition hit him. His pupils dilated slightly, fingers twitched against the blanket. I didn't say anything, just stared at him, letting him take in the fact that the son he'd disowned was sitting beside his deathbed. Finally, in a voice so weak it barely carried across the small space between us, he asked what I was doing there. That's when I smiled. Not a warm smile, the kind of smile a predator gives when cornered prey finally stops running. I told him I came to complete his final test. The next hour was the most satisfying of my entire life. I spoke calmly, methodically, explaining everything I'd done since the day he threw me out. Every struggle, every setback, every small victory. I showed him photos of the house I owned outright, pictures of Lauren and our 2 kids, a family built without his money or approval, my degrees, bachelor's and master's, earned while working full-time, bank statements showing investments and savings that dwarfed anything he'd accumulated at my age. His eyes followed my movements as I laid out document after document. He tried to speak once or twice, but I ignored him. This wasn't a conversation. This was a reckoning. Then came the business documents, the paperwork showing ownership transfers, the shell companies I'd created to acquire his suppliers, the agreements signed by the investors who'd pushed him out. All of it leading to one final document, proof that I now owned 51% of what had once been his legacy. I told him how I'd been systematically dismantling his life's work from the shadows, how every financial hardship he'd faced in the past decade had been engineered by me, the son he deemed unworthy. His breathing had become more labored, the heart monitor beeping a little faster. Good! I wanted him to feel something, anything. Then I pulled out the final item from my portfolio, an old, worn notebook, his test log, where he'd recorded every single challenge he'd ever set for Xavier and me, along with his ruthless evaluation. I'd found it in a box of Theodore's personal items Xavier had stored in his garage. I flipped through pages, reading highlights from different years. Age 7, failed to assemble bike without instructions. Age 10, only mowed the lawn in 27 minutes, not the required 25. Age 16, didn't earn enough at summer job to cover own school expenses. 15 years of documented psychological abuse, all written in his precise handwriting. For the first time since I started speaking, I looked directly into his eyes and asked the question that had burned inside me for 15 years. What kind of father turns childhood into a series of tests designed for his sons to fail? I wasn't prepared for what happened next. Theodore's face changed. The stern mask he'd worn my entire life cracked. His eyes filled with tears, actual tears, as he slowly reached one bony hand toward the notebook. I pulled it away, told him he hadn't earned the right to touch it. That's when he started talking. His voice was weak but steady as he told me about his own father, a man who'd beaten him daily, who'd once locked him in a shed for 2 days without food for getting a B on a math test, how he'd joined the military to escape only to find more brutal tests waiting for him there. He talked about Mom's death when we were little, how terrified he'd been of raising boys without her, how he'd convinced himself that the only way to prepare us for a harsh world was to make us stronger than he'd been. I sat there, listening despite myself. The heart monitor kept a steady backdrop to his confession. Was I supposed to feel sorry for him? Was this supposed to excuse decades of psychological torture? The man had systematically destroyed my self-worth, then discarded me when I finally stood up to him. And now he wanted, what? Forgiveness? When he finished speaking, tears were streaming down his hollow cheeks. The great Theodore, crying for the first time in my memory. He reached for my hand. I stood up, looked down at this broken man who'd once seemed larger than life, and I told him the truth, that knowing his backstory changed nothing for me, that I didn't come for reconciliation or forgiveness. I came to show him that I had passed every test that actually mattered, building a life, a family, and yes, taking his business, all without him. I told him I hoped he enjoyed knowing that everything he built would now belong to the son he threw away, that I would be changing the company name next week, erasing the last trace of his legacy. Then I packed up my documents, closed my laptop, and walked to the door. Behind me, the heart monitor's beeping had become erratic. Theodore was saying something, his voice urgent and pleading, something about being proud, about being sorry, too little, too late. I didn't look back as I walked out. Xavier was in the hallway, coffee cup halfway to his mouth, eyes wide as he took in my expression. He asked what happened, what I'd said to make our fathers so upset. I just shrugged, told him Theodore was all his now, that I'd said what I came to say. As I walked away, Xavier called after me, asking if I'd be at the funeral. I kept walking. Theodore died 3 days later. I didn't attend the service. Instead, I took my family to the beach house we'd rented for spring break, watched my kids build sand castles at the edge of the water. Lauren brought me a beer, sat beside me in the sand, asked if I was okay. Was I? TBH? I didn't know. The anger that had driven me for 15 years felt different now. Not gone, exactly. Just changed, like a fire that had finally consumed all its fuel. I told her I was fine, and in that moment, with the sun warm on my face and the sound of my children laughing nearby, it wasn't entirely a lie. The following Monday, I signed the paperwork to rename the business, not after myself. I wanted nothing that connected me to Theodore's legacy. Instead, I named it after my mother, the parent who had loved without condition, who had never needed us to prove our worth. Sometimes I think about those tears on Theodore's face in his final days, not with satisfaction or regret, but with a kind of detached curiosity. What exactly had broken him? Was it seeing all I'd accomplished without him? Was it realizing I now controlled everything he'd built? Or was it finally understanding what he'd thrown away 15 years ago? In the end, I decided it didn't matter. His tears changed nothing between us. The man had spent his life forcing others to prove their worth to him, only to die knowing he'd failed to prove his worth as a father. That seems like justice enough.